Hello, we are live, day 3 of Upswell. I'm Michael Crawford, Director of Marketing for MoveOn, joined by the fabulous Christina. Hi, Cristina.
Hi, good morning. Great to see. It's morning where I am, afternoon or still morning where you all are. I was going to say it's
Yeah,
nocturnal morning where I am.
Yeah, it's extra morning where you are, and thank you so much for joining us from the West Coast. So we are super happy to be here today for this session. Let's tell a new story of racial justice. As I said, I am Director of Marketing at MoveOn, where my work focuses a lot on how we use culture as a vehicle for engaging new audience, retaining current members, and figuring out how we shift the narrative around progressive issues and progressive values. Previously to MoveOn, I was Director of Digital and Creative at an organization called Freedom to Marry, which helped to win, well, the freedom to marry in the US, which is great. It's super wonderful for me, especially right now, because a lot of my friends who are same-sex couples are celebrating wedding anniversaries. And it was great to be a part of that.
I love seeing that. I've been seeing wedding anniversary celebrations.
Yeah. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Christina Urube, and zooming in from Oakland, California. I am the Director of Political Strategy at the Cultural Engagement Lab. And at the Cultural Engagement Lab, we bring artists and center artists in telling new stories and narratives around the world that we want to see. Really believe that artists have an ability to use their superpowers, as we call them, to help us envision a different world and tell new narratives around shifting big issues, sort of intractable, what's often feel like intractable issues, and think about how we create a different world through storytelling. And prior to coming to the Cultural Engagement Lab, I also serve as the Director of Campaigns at our sister organization called the Center for Cultural Power, formerly known as Culture Strike, which many people, if you've ever seen a butterfly that talks about migration is beautiful, our founder, Fabiana Rodriguez, is the artist behind that, and have spent the last well, I don't say how long now, because that really dates you, but I've spent a long time working at the center of politics and advocacy at the state, local, and national level, really trying to affect social change, political change with organizations like Emily's List and the National Education Association, tons of ballot measures as well. Ballot measures are really my jam, in part because it's issue focused and really speaks to people's values and where they are. And it's exciting to be at CEL, as we call it, because Cultural Engagement Lab can be a mouthful. It's exciting to be at CEL because that really is bringing all that experience and marrying it with storytelling and movement groups and artists to really talk about what we're going to talk about today, which is like, how do we tell different stories and as a way to really have an effect change. And, one thing we do is bring science into that, which we'll also talk about sort of what the data shows around what's effective too.
And so, Cristina and I are lucky enough to work together, or I'm lucky enough to work with Cristina. And among the things that we talk about a lot is how do we shift narratives or shift culture in ways that help us move on seemingly intractable, as Cristina said, issues. So I'm going to talk a little bit about work that I did to help win marriage equality, but we're just kind of going to lay out what we believe to be true. Which is that so much of the stories that we tell right now, especially about racial justice, are rooted in harm, in violence. For example, Black folks who are killed by police are rooted in poverty, are rooted in struggle. Think about like all of the images that we've been seeing lately around Haitian immigrants, Latino immigrants, and what some conservatives are calling a crisis at the border. Like, it's not a crisis at the border, it's just, we have an opportunity to help people. And so, but our belief is that if we tell a new story, one that's rooted in joy and abundance and resilience and possibility, that we can actually accelerate the movement towards racial justice. And I think we've seen that at moments in American history, right? So if you look at like the civil rights movement, 50s, 60s, the Black Power movement, 60s, 70s, a lot of that, which was very much intense political and social change times. But if you look at that, a lot of what, like, for example, MLK's I Have a Dream, right? Like that was calling people to greatness. He was laying out a vision of what we could possibly be. And we believe that through art, storytelling, and culture, that we can call people to greatness in similar fashion.
Yeah, one of the things just to, that we've definitely talked a lot about, Michael and I, because we do work together and share a similar view on this, is at CEL and the Center for Cultural Power, we don't traffic in trauma. We believe that obviously, and we see this with documentarians and others, there are important stories to tell, but we think about how are we engaging people who are marginalized or have every reason to believe, to be cynical. Cynicism is so appealing and attractive. And fear is such an easy tool to use. But, when we look back at our 2020 work, which we're going to get into in a little bit, one of the things that going into the last election cycle in particular, that wasn't even on the table for us. It was both based on research around what we needed to do to help people believe that participating is worth it. And when we think about Black and Latinx and API and Indigenous communities and young people, again, people who have every reason to believe that institutions and systems don't work for them. And so when we reinforce trauma, it's a demobilizing effect that we see with audiences and with people. People know the circumstances that they live in, or that their families have lived in, or their communities, or that the schools that they went to 10 years ago maybe still aren't serving their same community. They're aware of what's happening around police violence. And so showing images of trauma actually have a demobilizing effect. And in the long term, which I think, Michael, you and I are both really committed to, it's like there's these short-term interventions where sometimes we are using content and messages that actually hurt the long-term shifts that we're trying to see in the world, that everyone who's at the summit is trying to see around belonging and engaging and creating sort of movements rooted in joy and resilience. So trauma porn is often how we refer to it, but those images that whether it's children in cages or police brutality and increasingly murder that we see from an engagement standpoint and storytelling standpoint, those are not the kind of things that help people believe that participating in our democracy and their communities is worth it. And again, don't get us to the type of world that we're all trying to build together, one of care and resilience and joy. And again, part of the reason I think you see some of that is it's easier to do fear-based and trauma-based messaging. And that's why we think artists, we know it's hard to create a vision for a different kind of world, but we also know people can't believe in something they can't see. And so we need to create that world. And again, artists, creative storytellers have the power to do that. And we all also know that they have to see it consistently and over to believe that as well. And we're sort of swimming in this ocean of where still so much of what they're seeing isn't reflective of that world we're trying to build together.
And Cristina, when you were talking, it reminded me of a quote from researcher, linguistic expert Anat Shankar-Asario, when she says, people have 99 problems, they don't need yours.
Yes.
So to that end, we are going to share examples of the work that I did with Freedom to Marry around that helped to win marriage equality. Christina is going to talk about the amazing work that Cultural Engagement Lab did around the 2020 elections and helping with voter turnout. But first, I think Christina has a couple of ads and a question that she wants to share.
Yeah, so you're going to see two ads back to back, and then we're going to ask you a poll question about which one you thought was more effective. So we're going to go ahead and play those now for you. And as Michael said, these were from 2020.
This year was, well, it was one for the books. I didn't even know if I was going to come back to work. Then all at once, everything changed. It was me. I did it. Single-handedly turned this nation around.
What happened? What changed?
What do you mean? You don't know?
We are one vote away. Your vote matters.
This is my favorite part right here.
Watch. The next leader of our country, Eric, you are the winning.
That's
vote.
me.
Please do not respond.
I did it. And I'm a hero. Me. Can do. Can do.
Mamá, which milk should I use?
¿Esto es un chiste? ¿Estás jugando?
Life is full of difficult choices. This isn't one of them.
Okay, so we're going to take a little poll on which one you thought was most effective. And the one thing I didn't say before we showed them was, in 2020, we were really thinking about a multiracial audience. Again, the folks that we've been talking about, primarily young people under the age of 35, and Black and Latinx audiences as well. Folks who aren't typically engaged, people that often we're not communicating with and waiting 60 days before an election, and again with messaging that we just shared. So we were, creating content around like what would break through, what would be both persuasive around this question of cynicism and giving people a reason to believe that participating is worth it. What's the kind of content that would be both persuasive and mobilizing? And was there different emotions that appealed to different audiences? As we all know, I say this all the time, I'm Latina, we contain multitudes. We shouldn't create content, like one piece of content for all people of color, which is also what happens so much in more of the political electoral world. There's a lot of us. And so what are the different type of emotions and type of content that is really engaging and motivating? So I think folks are probably answering that question.
Well,
Go ahead, Michael.
I will say that the milk ad, the spoiled milk gets me every time. It gets me every time, and the mom reminds me of my grandma, which is great.
Yeah.
And and Eric is the man. He did it.
Yeah, so I this, no spoiler alert this is a spoiler alert as people are answering. The surprise is they were both equally effective with the audiences we were trying to engage. We were testing our content with so this is where I get a little sciencey with something known as opinion lift research, where online people would view these ads as you're viewing your Liverpool match or an A's game, or something would come up in the people are online and ask them to watch this ad and answer a few questions, and we have a control group where people don't see it. And both of those, again, were highly effective. Oh, okay, so vote, good. I mean, listen, I know the actor in that, Bobby, but was interesting. And milk, humor is something that it can be a little tricky because what we all find funny could be different. So what we measured when we tested our content was a range of emotions. If people, an ad made them feel sad, or if an ad made them, if an ad was boring, or if it concerned or angry. And then we looked at how that correlated to, were they more likely to take an action like voting or engage in the election? And what was fascinating, what we saw was, so Michael and I could view an ad like we just did, and we would both have the same emotional reaction. We would both find milk funny, or we both find winning vote inspirational or humorous as well. What our mobilization looked like correlated to that could look a little bit different. So we saw with some Latinx audiences, they were more motivated by things that had more of a sense of urgency, or we saw with some Black audiences much more motivated by things that were joyful, humorous, inspiring. What was interesting about both of these ads is they were two rare ones that had the exact same sort of emotional response and mobilization impact across audiences, both Black and Latinx and young people. I mean, I will just say, just vote Joe, that line came from my 21-year-old niece, who was definitely, we all knew them. This is not, an electoral political conversation in that regard. We're not going to relitigate the election, but my niece was very much like, I'm really uninspired by this election. And, she was like, I guess when I go in, I'll just vote, Joe. And I remember talking to the artist we were working with, and I was like, my niece, this is who we're trying to engage, 21-year-old Latina who feels like really cynical about, does any of this make a difference? Will any of this matter? And last thing I'll say about winning vote, we can get more into this, after and the Q&A is also, that was a bit improvised. And again, it's why we work with artists. The people we work with who created those ads, they didn't do political ads. That's not what that's not like, they produce documentaries. They work with folks who are probably selling you Nike shoes or, their short film, they're creatives, they're working with their friends and, just sort of starting off. And those were the people who were reflective of the communities we were trying to reach. And again, who are engaging as an artist in outside of the political realm and in politics. We haven't really tapped into that energy. And so winning vote, what was so great about that, we told them, like, this is a story we're trying to tell, like everything we've been talking about this morning. And they sort of improvised. Bobby's actually the name of the actor in Winning Vote. And he sort of was like, that can do. I will say in our office, after we saw that, like everyone was like, can do for the rest of the election. But again, that just goes to show you why we feel so passionately about what happens when you bring artists into helping us tell stories and creatives and storytellers, and really tapping into those emotions of joy and resilience, and that those can be equally mobilizing and engaging, and then sometimes even more persuasive because they don't look like everything else that people are seeing or being told. So
yeah. Thank you, Cristina. And,
Yeah.
and so it was interesting to see that 67% of the people thought Winning Vote was the ad that was most persuasive, and 33% thought Milk was most persuasive, when in reality, it was a trick question.
It was equally, it was a trick question. Sorry.
No apologies. Both were great. And so I'm going to talk a little bit now about the work that I did with Freedom to Marry, to help win marriage equality. And I'm going to talk about three things. One, I'm going to talk about how we thought about the language that we used and the messaging that we employed. Two, how we took that messaging from bullet pointed talking points from our research team and turned it into actually compelling stories. And I'll share a 30-second example of how we did that. And then I'll reflect a little bit on what I think we can take from the win on marriage and how we ended up talking about marriage, and use that in our work as we're trying to advance racial justice. So I'm going to set the picture. Back in the day, around 2010, support for same-sex couples getting married was in the low 40%, meaning that the majority of the country was opposed to allowing gay couples to marry. It was shortly, not too long after, a wave of anti-marriage ballot amendments had been passed across the country, I believe in over 30 states. In 2004, former President Bush had used it as an opportunity to try to juice up conservative voters and turn them out so that he could win re-election. It was a dark time for those of us in the LGBT community who supported the freedom to marry. Now, also at that time, the way that we were talking about things, we were talking about not amending state level constitutions, right? So because a lot of the battles had been around state level constitutions, we were talking about, it's not a real concern. Let's not amend constitutions. Then we were also talking about it in the context of rights, right? So I don't know how much you may think about the rights and responsibilities that are ended up connected to or associated to marriage. There are roughly 1,200 federal rights and responsibilities connected to marriage. And then there are also hundreds of state level protections as well. And those vary by state. So in some states like California, it's a lot because California is a lot. In my state of New York, it's also a lot, but it varies. And so we were talking about things in, fairly technical terms, rights and responsibilities, don't amend state level constitutions. And there was a reason that we were doing that, because we were under attack. We felt that we needed to make that case, and we did the best that we could with what we had in that moment. Now, in 2010, which is when I joined the staff for Freedom to Marry, we did a couple of things. We pulled together, working with other, LGBTQ organizations and allied organizations as well, pulled together all the research that we could find on people's attitudes around gay couples and marriage, and crunched that data. We did focus groups talking to, straight people, because straight people were the ones that we really needed to talk to and to move on the issue. And we took all of that together, crunched it together, and came up with what we thought was going to be better, stronger, more effective messaging. And I'll say one thing about the focus groups that we found was that when we asked straight people who had not made up their minds about whether or not a gay couple should marry, so like that middle group of people, persuadables, we asked them, why do you think same-sex couples want to marry? Well, first we asked them why straight couples wanted to marry, and they said straight couples wanted to marry for love and commitment, family, all those good positive things. What they said about same-sex couples is that we wanted to marry for the rights, for the benefits, for what we could get out of it. In other words, they saw this dichotomy between what straight couples wanted, which were all these things around love, commitment, family, the good warm values type things, and what they saw as same-sex couples wanting, meaning what we could actually get out of it, right? Like the tangible benefits of marriage that no one really thinks about. And so we shifted our message from focusing on rights and benefits to love, family, commitment. And we started to focus on value-based communications, which was a big shift for the marriage movement, and took a little while for us to really get that down. So instead of there being constitutional law experts talking about marriage, we started to center gay couples and their families talking about why they wanted to get married. And as the campaign went on, we started to win more states. We won DC, we won New York, etc. We expanded it a little bit beyond just the couple, because we know the couples don't exist in a vacuum. We exist in a larger family. We exist in a community. We exist in cities and states as well. And so we opened that up a little bit. And so one of the things I'm going to do in a second is show you a quick example of an ad that we ran in Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama. It became the first pro-marriage ad that ran in those states. And we're going to show you that ad now.
I can't imagine anyone loving a person as much as I love my wife. Alabama does not recognize our marriage. Everyone wants to believe that if you do what you're supposed to do, your family will be taken care of. But we don't have that safeguard, that every child can feel good about the home they come from. Isn't that what matters?
Love is love.
Yes. So that ad hit on a number of things, and I'll tell you how we got there. So at this point, I think we released that ad in 2014. We had won marriage in a number of states on the West Coast, a few in the center of the country, a number in the East Coast. And so the South was the place where we needed to win and where we needed to show actually the Supreme Court, because our eye was always on a national victory, the Supreme Court, that America, the entirety of America was ready for marriage. So we launched a campaign called Southerners for the Freedom to Marry. That ad was part of that campaign. We saw Black folks as being an opportunity for increasing support, knowing that Black people have a strong presence in Southern states like Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, etc. And if you notice, we also included scenes from a church. Because one of the things that we did not do in this campaign was cede faith and religion to the opposition. We claimed faith and religion for those folks who were that. And so that's one example of how we thought about storytelling. We did storytelling around openly gay service members who were serving in the military, but the federal government was forced to discriminate against them because of what was then the Defense of Marriage Act. We told stories of bi-national same-sex couples who were under threat of being ripped apart, again, because of federal discrimination. And I think that there are a couple of lessons that we can take from that work that we did at Freedom to Marry. One being that the way that we talk to people matters. The stories that we tell matter. Cristina pointed out how Cell has done research to figure out how to actually talk about people, how to actually talk about voting and the issues, and then they put that messaging into the hands of artists and gave artists the opportunity to do what artists do so well, which is create and tell stories. And that really matters because it helps us to break through, the data and the harshness, and allows us to shift hearts and minds. We can also take a lesson in that we don't have to target everything to everybody. So with campaigns like Southerners for the Freedom to Marry, we had Young Conservatives for the Freedom to Marry, we had Mayors for the Freedom to Marry, we had tons of subgroups who were supportive of the Freedom to Marry. And so the lessons I would say that we can take are how we talk about the issues matter. And we should do it in ways that are not necessarily ones that feel good to us, but that are designed to reach our target audiences. We can target our content and our storytelling to specific groupings of people, and that will give us a better chance of being effective. And we should have fun and joy and ground everything in values.
Yes. To all of that. I mean, it is this idea, that again, in part because of a small segment of what we see, something you and I talked about too around early on, like, is there, we hear a lot, like, in this moment of heightened division. I just saw a headline yesterday. California had a little recall a few weeks ago that was overwhelmingly defeated, like 60+% high turnout election. But there was a headline yesterday that's like, recall results show, even more division. And I was like, but like a majority is actually not a big division. It's like 70% of the people, is it? And so I think it's, again, easy, and not to diminish the challenges that we have in the country, but the stories that you hear and what they reflect. Like, we're not hearing stories of how communities came together during COVID in record numbers around mutual aid and supporting each other and looking out for each other. And even in the vaccine rollout around, 99% of the WNBA, I think they're 100% now, but 99% of the WNBA being vaccinated. Like, I don't remember those headlines and those stories, but I do know about the 2 or 3 unvaccinated high profile NBA players, right? And so there's also this like focus on sort of that negativity and that reinforces division. And again, this is not trying to diminish that, but find the commonality around shared values and what we have in common and what binds us together, what brings us together. And again, when we think about in particular marginalized communities that aren't often heard from, I think what you're seeing too is we just have more vehicles for people to express themselves as well. So we are hearing more from people about a different kind of world they want to see. And what we saw in 2020 that we think really applies to everything that we're testing right now, we're about to launch a series called Beyond Status around immigration, whereas beyond status and people's status, not unlike what Michael just shared around the fight for marriage equality, which is so much of what we hear about immigration is centered on the border, which is a place, and trauma. It is not so much as focused on immigration policy, but not often on migrants and people who are both documented and undocumented, and who they are as people. And so we're getting ready, I think actually on Monday, to launch something called Beyond Status, which is a series of stories told by formerly or currently undocumented filmmakers in the US, artists who, again, we're thinking about how do we shift the narrative around immigration off of policy and place into people and what we all want, to thrive, to succeed, to have love, to have families, to have joy. And again, trying to create that world for folks to show what's possible, because so often what happens, and your example is a great one, Michael, where people will be like, I don't know the answer to climate crisis. I'm not a climate expert. That's okay. But if you see, if we're telling stories around like what's currently working is what's currently happening isn't working, it's broken. And so our stories invite people in to imagine something different. I have to have all the answers to know this is broken, this isn't working, we deserve better, we collectively make the future. So much of what we focus on is in that collective we, even when we're engaging in politics, because we do this work year round. So even when we're engaging in electoral, for us, it's less so about a candidate. Just Vote Joe tells you everything you need to know about how focused we are on candidates, which is we're not. We're sort of focused on the community and us and what we do together. Because when we think about big shifts, especially around racial justice, and moving away from these narratives that are rooted in extraction and domination and white supremacy, and moving to narratives that are rooted in resilience and joy and interdependence. Whatever story we're talking about, whatever issue, those are the things that need to root the stories we're telling. And again, that we know really engage people on, and that is that feeling around what's possible and seeing it. When I worked at Emily's List, I used to train hundreds and thousands of women running for political office. And the one thing we would say in all of our trainings back then, it's a little bit better now, but we would always say, like, young women can't be what they can't see. And that's often why they don't run. That is true around everything we care about. It is hard to believe in something that you can't see, and even harder to imagine it. And it's why it's that our approach to this work and culture as a strategy writ large, which you talked about, faith and church, like that is a big part of our culture. We shouldn't be leaving any of those tools on the table. So whether it's sports, which Michael and I are a big fan of, sports that bring people together, faith and religion and what motivates people, that being rooted in shared values, and really lean into that. As Michael mentioned earlier, Anat, a colleague of ours who does a lot of work around this, will always say, don't talk about the recipe, talk about the brownie, right? Like, we always want to talk about the ingredients, but like, talk about the brownie. Like, everyone wants to talk about the brownie and how delicious it tastes, and like that smell of freshly baked brownies in your house. So yeah, I mean, that is again where our approach comes to this around inspiration and what's possible. And again, cutting through, we're up against sort of stories that do center a lot of trauma, but also there's just a lot more noise. So we're also always thinking about just how we cut through and reach people. And again, for us, it's definitely a multiracial coalition, and engaging and trying different things like humor, inspiration, joy, and what we've consistently seen in all the testing we did. And you can go to our website. We have all of our learnings from 2020 on there. If you go to engagementlab.org. I almost forgot our website. If you go there, you'll see we have a whole report, and you'll actually see all the content that we released in 2020 that gives you sort of that wide spectrum of what we did to cut through. But that was definitely one of the takeaways that we saw, was that content that was had inspiration and urgency and joy, regardless of audience, had the most positive effect on being persuasive and mobilizing. And things like, I should also add, like, over information. We also get into this, like, if people only knew, or if they were only educated. I'll just go back to what I said earlier, what you talked about on, like, what was focused on policy and civil rights. People know. And things like that. For some reason, whenever we're trying to engage Black and Latinx and API and Indigenous and more marginalized communities, women, we often think like the content needs to be educational, like somehow those communities need education and everyone else gets entertainment. That's not the case. That's like, so we also need to break out of that. And I'll turn it back over to you, Michael. I just think of something a colleague of mine said just yesterday. We were talking on a call, and people are talking about litigation, because so much around election rights and things like that is sort of in litigation mode. And I was like, well, let's just be clear. Litigation's a goalie strategy. That's not a, so we're protecting, we don't want to get scored on. So that's like our goalie strategy, but like we need this whole other one as well. That's like on winning and going on offense. And my colleague said, yeah, I mean, we don't, the attorneys don't let the storytellers in the courtroom to argue legal cases. We should not be asking attorneys and lawyers to tell our story around voting rights and democracy. And that, for me, I was like, yes, that is not what we should be doing. And we're defaulting to that on sort of the issue of our day around democracy. And those are not the stories that we need to be telling. It should not be around the legalese and sort of what's being litigated, but again, what it is that we're all aspiring to and want to see in this country.
Yeah, that's great. So if you have questions or comments, supporting what we said, opposing what we said, offering a different view, please submit those now, because we're going to be taking questions and discussing your questions and comments in a moment. And one thing I just wanted to say, Cristina, is that when we were talking earlier in the week, of course, we talked about soccer and Liverpool. And my background is Liverpool, not just because we are playing our biggest rival, Manchester United, this weekend, but it's also an example of what Cristina and I have been talking about. Mo Salah, who is a player from Egypt, who now plays for Liverpool, and he's arguably the best football player in the world right now, and they should re-sign him and pay him whatever he wants. But that's just my personal editorial opinion. One of the things that has been noted is that anti-Muslim sentiment has decreased in Liverpool based on his presence with the team. Now, of course, part of it is that he is the best football player in the world right now. So he's helping Liverpool win games, but it's also what both Cristina and I have referenced around shared values. People are commenting on the fact that they see him as a good person. And so, which is something that I think if we're able to tap into those common values, we can shift how people are thinking. So we have a question.
Yeah. in some advocacy areas, it feels like immediate threats and negative frames get more engagement from existing networks. Very true. I think we've both worked for organizations where that's the case. The alarmist emails that you get 20 times in 1 week. How can organizations effectively balance messages to mobilize existing supporters versus those who need to be persuaded? Sort of reframing as offensive strategy. That's a great question. I'll go super quick, and then interested to hear what Michael has to say, because maybe we disagree. But I always think there's sort of three things when we're thinking about storytelling and engagement, which is like animating. How do we sort of animate people who we might consider our base, who are already with us or agree with us on an issue? How do we animate them to like take that one step further and take action, engage their neighbors, and become active in effort? Then there's folks who are like, who are we persuading, who are curious and conflicted? So don't think political partisanship, but people who might be like, yeah, I think it's wrong to discriminate against people who, are same sex, want to marry, but I'm not sure what does that mean. And I'm sure we see this narrative, like we see this on immigration, like children in cages is bad, but like, should we have open borders? Those are the curious, conflicted folks that we're trying to persuade to, again, call in and say, you don't need to have all the answers to that. Let's start with like, is this broken? Do we agree? Is this unfair? Is this not what we want to see in the world? Yes. And so those are the people you're sort of less trying to persuade from my standpoint, but who are curious and conflicted, and we're trying to call in. And then there's a segment of people, to be quite candid, we're just trying to neutralize. We don't want those messages of hate and fear to take root. We know they exist, but we're sort of trying to neutralize and inoculate against those and spend most of our storytelling. Again, I work for, we're in the social change movement. So we definitely have sort of outcomes we want to see, but it's really around how do we animate? And as Michael said, if we're all sort of taking different slices of that as well and thinking about the different stories rooted in the same narratives that we're trying to use to engage different audiences, we all don't have to sort of be like squirrel and chasing the same thing and doing the exact same thing. But Michael, I don't know what you think about that challenge.
And I think what you said about narrative is important, right? Because the narrative is like this overarching, if you've watched any of the Star Trek shows, there's always the prime directive. The narrative is kind of the prime directive. And all of the Star Trek missions would go to support or advance or be guided by that prime directive. So if we have a narrative of what it is that we want to say, or the vision that we want to create, then even those immediate threats can be used to support or connect to that overarching narrative. So I work for MoveOn. We're a rapid response organization. So something bad happens, we jump on it, try to engage our supporters in making a difference. So the alarmist emails that are clogging up Christina's inbox may be from us. But I think it's in part to capture the energy that is usually surfaces when there is a negative thing that's happened. But then the important part is to flip it so that it reconnects with the overarching narrative or vision that you're trying to communicate and create. So take the bad things that are happening, react to those, pivot, and connect it to your overarching story.
We have a couple of questions on how to center people and tell their own stories without making them feel exploited, which is a great one. And then where to start around considering sort of a positive values-based communication. Let's try and take like 30 seconds and then kick it to Michael, because I know we're almost out of time, which is authentic stories. And everyone is a storyteller. I'm one of the few, I would say, non-artists at the organization, but we're all storytellers. And that is really where you start, as sort of your own personal story and why you're somewhere, and giving people that voice. And again, we tell artists, like, these are sort of the guardrails of the stories we're trying to tell, but really giving people the freedom to do that. And we've seen continuously, even though the two ads you saw that I showed were pretty highly produced, some of our best performing were what looked a little bit like someone shot on their iPhone, which were really resonating again, because it cuts through. So that authenticity of sharing stories and getting into the practice of telling stories. And then where you start is really what Michael said too, from this positive frame, which is, what is it that talking about the world you want to see. And that's really where you start from when you're trying to consider that and think about that world you're trying to shift to is where we start. We start with two questions. What's the narrative we're trying to shift? What's the story we're trying to tell in our work?
And you can do that with people's personal stories. And then there was in that first question, there was a question about not making people feel exploited or placing them at risk. We actually asked people, if they're willing to be talk to the media, etc. And then we work with them to share their story. If they're not willing to do that, then we can, maybe share their story without a name attached, but we just make sure that people are comfortable. And so I know that we have like 90 seconds left. And so we want to thank everybody who has joined us, folks who've submitted questions. We especially want to thank the folks at Upswell, especially Allison and Jeff, who you probably don't know, but they are in the background running things, making sure that all is smooth with the presentation that we've run today. And
I just want to say thank you, Michael, for inviting me to join you too. Just sort of your idea. So it's a great way to start my morning.
Well, thank you for joining us at what is 7 a.m. for you. So hopefully you can get a little bit of downtime, maybe a little bit of coffee. And so with that, we want to just say thank you so much. We hope that you will join us in telling stories and shifting narratives that are rooted in values, because we really believe that when we are connected around a shared sense of values, that we can shift the narratives that will help us to accelerate the movement towards racial justice. And with that, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the day at Upswell and have a great weekend.